Copper Jackals for my game prep. So I wanted to kind of start with the basics of what I do to get ready. So I have Photoshop document that you guys saw the last time I was talking about some other stuff, where I kind of prep these little thumbnails ahead of time and get their actual size and specification. But basically, this is the Three Moons Harvest game prep video. So as far as custom thumbnails goes, if you are interested in that, the information is available via YouTube, but I will kind of make it easy for you. The dimensions are 1280 by 720, and that's 1280 long, 720 tall. And with that dimensions, you can actually make a file in GIMP or even in Photoshop if you happen to have that. And basically, let me pull up mine real quick here. What I did is I made a master file that has all the different colors and pictures that I use all in one file. That way, whenever I need to change anything, add anything, edit, do things like that, I actually just pull up this file, and then once it's up, take a little while here, it comes up with the document. And then let's say, you know, I want to do a world building video. I just turn on the green, switch my picture over to the world building picture, and then I change the text. Super easy. So if you decide to do thumbnails and you want to use a continual pattern like I've been using, this is a great way to go about it. But for now, let's just kind of talk about what we are doing with game prep. So this is kind of just a little bonus thing here. I'm not going to save that for now. So for game prep for the Copper Jackals game, this is, once again, OneNote, my favorite program to use for any sort of note-taking. What I started off with was my basic idea. Originally, I didn't even know who my players were going to be, so we're going to kind of skip that for now. So I sat there in my microbiology class learning about how infectious diseases spread. And one of the things that we talked about is spores, and how they're super hard to actually stop if you have a bacteria that goes into a spore state. And I was thinking about it, and some of the bacteria that can go into spore states happen to be funguses, which brought me over to thinking about the fact that, you know, a lot of the times when I play D&D, I don't use a lot of the kind of more unique creatures, like the plant-based creatures. And in 5th edition, there's this wonderful plethora of plant-based creatures. In fact, it's probably the most enticing group of plant-based creatures that D&D has ever come out with. I'll go ahead and blanketly make that statement right here. 5th edition does the best plant creatures, period. So my inspiration was the myconids. They are a plant creature that kind of looks like a big mushroom. And I had this idea of them being infected by a disease, and I had to label out that it was a disease because we're talking about D&D, and there is spells and things like that can fix it. So I have to make it official and say, oh, it's a disease. Basically, the bacterial strain was introduced to the colony, and I get a little technical here, so forgive me. The bacterial strain was introduced it should be the colony here. That gives them immunity to sun sickness, which is one of the myconid defects. Because they're from the Underdark, they get sun sickness. But as a side effect, it also makes them extremely violent. The spore servants get a spore pod growing on them, which will grow in the correct conditions. However, if they die, the spore pods will open and spew bacteria on the creature that killed the host. Will turn the creature into a spore servant with madness, and once a new host is found, spores remain dormant until the host dies. Once the host dies, the host actually raises as a spore servant, which is kind of a callback to one of the myconid sovereign, what he can do, which is spread spores over a dead body and make it rise up as a new myconid. So if it falls on a human, the catch here is that the human has to die first. But if they die, they automatically come back as a myconid that has this spore condition with it. And I wanted to make this spore thing a little bit more than just a traditional bacteria, because that's kind of weird to play out in a fantasy game. So I wanted to make it have a host, or at least a master controller, if you would. Now let's talk about the madness. Now the madness, I just called it madness, and it's a DC 14 charisma save. Now, a lot of you may be wondering why I chose charisma. as the save. Now, the reason I decided to do that is it's a mind control thing. I don't think that there's a lot of stuff that uses some of the other saves, and you know, I figured because there's a mind control element to it and that there's a core creature controlling them all, charisma felt like a good thing to do. It was separating their own force of presence from the greater hive mind, if you would. So charisma save is what I went with. 14 is a little difficult for level 3s, but one of my players kind of succumbed to it, but they were able to cure it before the end, so that was cool. Basically, a failed save means you become infected, and the spores will remain dormant until the time of their death, which is why when that player became infected, I didn't really tell them that, you know, you're infected, because yes, he's infected, but he's not going to have any signs or symptoms. Now, just a kind of medical background here. The signs are what everyone can see, symptoms are what a patient directly feels, but there's not necessarily outward signs that can be done, which is where we get terms like asymptomatic, meaning that that they don't see any symptoms, but there could possibly be signs. Again, getting a little technical, but not super important for you guys to know, just more if you decide to use some sort of bacteria or anything like that inside your own games. And if you do have questions about that and you want to shoot me a message, I can help you out a little bit. I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination, but I do have a little bit of background in it, and I can help you out. And then I've got a flavor text that I threw in here so I could remind myself about what would happen if they become infected after a little while, and telling them and this is the quote I actually used in the game, a black hard growth emerges. It stings with a burning pain. You smell the flesh melt away and expose the foreign agent. Even if you scratch it, it does nothing to ease the pain. So a lot of GMs will tell you that you should involve different senses, and so with this I have the feeling of touch, there's the smell, you have pain in there, which is also a subsidiary of touch, but still it's a different activating agent for those nerves. So it's definitely a different sensation, and I thought that was kind of a cool way to do it. Now, once they become infected, it's actually harder to heal them, and I decided to make it a heal check that requires a healer's kit, DC 16, or remove disease the spell. Originally I wasn't going to put that there, but because we're playing D&D, there are spells and magic, I have to keep that in mind, so remove disease happens to be one of the solutions to the problem. Now, I did this very straightforward from the book, 5th edition style, because I haven't played with the way 5th edition frames up adventures, and I wanted to see how it works out. I've done some little extras to it because that's pretty much my style. I do it the way that they suggest, and then I add the things that I know that are going to benefit me, just to try it out before I necessarily decide to throw out everything that they're talking about. This is the anniversary of an important event, 3 Moons Harvest, and then I just call it TMH from there. It is particularly good harvest season. Once every 5 years in the Ezeros Island, rare herbs can be found. And then I talked about these herbs right at the beginning of the game because I had a character that was super interested in learning and things like that, and because of his background, he would have known these things coming in. Originally, I was planning on letting them kind of discover these plants as they go through the story, maybe the villagers talking to them, but I had a great group of characters that were selected for this. And I also had a great group of players playing those characters, but I wanted to make the distinction because I think the characters were just the right fit. It was a really awesome cast that we put together. So I've got like the Dihydrodon, which talks about here what it does, and what I wanted to do was have some unique flowers in there that if they decided to gather them up, these are items that are consumable. So, you know, if you know, somebody was to say, hey, I really like the Dihydrodon, and in the official Copper Jackals, we're going to go ahead and keep that one and some of these other plants that you talked about. Awesome. The one that I was especially kind of hoping gets put into the Copper Jackals official canon is Vanium, which is the special flower that they were really here to get. Basically, it produces an ink that's a copper metallic color without any sort of additives. You could just put it within your medium and grind up the actual the stamen of the flower to get the minerals from it that you need. Which is how some of the classic inks and paints were actually originally done. But basically, once that ink was made, it was used to be inscribed into the magic tattoos that the Copper Jackals wear. So that gave them an official reason to be there beyond what their official reason was, which was to guard the bandit from the bandits. So why the Copper Jackals? Officially there as guard duty. Bandits have been known to attack during this time. Unofficially, they're here to collect Vanium for the Copper Jacks rites ceremony. Right there and there, I just kind of spelled it out plain, everything that I just talked to you about. I like complications and twists, so I decided to put this one inside here. Here's the twist. The adventurers are racing against the other creatures of Myconids with the same or opposite goal. And I decided to define that a little bit further. Basically, the goal of the Myconids is to consume the Vanium plants and other plants. They've ate all of the underdark food sources, and they have to consume. That's part of the madness, is that they are forced to consume organic matter, which I didn't put up inside this definition, but I kept it in mind after I wrote this, which is why during the game the Myconid seedlings were just eating plants and wouldn't attack the players unless the player happened to have some plant material on them. In the case of Manet. Now, for a complication of the side quest, this one didn't get highlighted as much, but it's a side quest, so it's not super important that it came to light. Basically, discover the nature and origin of the strange phenomena in the area. They could have entirely done this quest without finding out anything about the bacteria. They could have just been, murder hobos, kill all the monsters, call it a day. But they did actually go about this, which is why I said I think I had a really awesome group of players and characters for this adventure, because when I presented the disease to them, this was immediately where they went. I didn't even have to suggest it at all or anything like that, or have like an NPC come up and go, oh no, there's a disease, you need to figure it out. They totally jumped on it and did a phenomenal job, so thanks to those guys. But basically, they can discover the origin, and they can even attempt to cure it using a mixture of Vanium and Piranha Hibiscus, which will actually put a little more tension on the story if they decide to do this, which they did. So they understood what that was, and they know that it will save the people at the cost of the Vanium, which is for the Copper Jackals directly. And like I said, the villain's desire is to feed and grow. Villain I'm using pretty liberally because the Myconids are not necessarily the villain of the story. The villain, I'll actually show you him here in just a second here. So I broke this down into categories: who my important NPCs, allies, and all that is. This is basically the way that they tell you. I have a different way that I like a little better, and I'm probably not going to use this format again. It worked fine. It just wasn't the one that I'm used to. So looking at this chart was not as I expected it. So our adventure villains are the Myconids. The Spore Hydra is basically it's a Hydra that I rescanned, gave it a little less hit points, and gave it some special moves. The adventurers' allies are Vulin, the male elf druid, Lady Arquette of the Fire, female paladin knight, who will aid in protection from the bandits, and then I have the Copper Lieutenant Tavin Frosthammer, the male dwarf fighter. He's kind of a bastard. That's how I put him inside the notes here. Now, I've received a couple compliments on Tavin and Lady Arquette, their relationship. A lot of that stuff I did on the fly, to be honest. I wanted Tavin to have this marking thing about him, other than the fact that he was a bastard. Because if you're joining the Copper Jackals, since they're all pretty much wanted men, it wouldn't be too surprising that there was going to be some asshole guy in charge. Oh yeah, fair warning, I curse a bunch. If you're on my channel and hadn't figured that out, I'm sorry if I've offended you, but I'm going to continue to curse. I used to be in the Navy, and that's my excuse. I am a sailor, and therefore I have the mouth of one. Regardless, I wanted Tavin to have this lasting impression, so I got this idea in my head of like the 80s flat top, the tall one that like you used to see a lot of people have, that like real rigid one. And that's how I described his beard, and that seemed to be the highlight of the game. Everybody loved that, and I feel like I have to put Tavin somewhere else and have him reoccur, because people would just really loved Tavin because he was kind of a hard ass. And he had this unique beard about him, but you could see a different side of him, which was awesome because one of my players actually decided to investigate the conversation between Tavin and Frosthammer. And originally, I wasn't planning on any players doing that, and so I kind of shot from the hip for that scene. And there's kind of this charge scene between Tavin and Lady Arquette in the game, which basically we find out that Lady Arquette, and if you hadn't seen the episode, go ahead and check it out before I spoil it for you, because I am going to reveal spoilers. That's pretty much what this entire video is, if you hadn't figured it out already. But Lady Arquette was asked to join the Copper Jackals on a couple of occasions and actually denied it. And there's this little bit of hostility, but you can tell that there's some care between the two of them. I didn't explicitly put it out there because I don't want to define their relationship just yet, but I want them to have a history, and so I left it kind of open, and my players had kind of some ideas of what their relationship may have been. But it was definitely interesting, and I think the players really enjoyed that. So basically what I'm saying here with this section is, if you put down a NPC or something like that, and you discover something that's more interesting as you're GMing, and let's say you go off the beaten path, you shoot from the hip a little, once you find it and it becomes interesting, make sure that it stays in your game. Nothing that you put in your prep notes is 100%. Only the stuff that goes into the game at the time of the game is 100%. It's not canon until it happens, is kind of the way to think about it. I decided to make it to where Frosthammer would become infected, and that was a really good point because I had one player that had to leave a little early, and so he left to go tend to Frosthammer and the villagers because the infection was spreading. And then their patrons are the Copper Jackals and the town of Leongai, which is the island's name and the town's name. Now, key locations, they're in Chapter 5. I decided not to do that. I didn't really care for the way that it was set up, mainly because I had an idea of what I wanted from this island anyways. So I really didn't bother with that. Instead, I kind of thought about like this small hovel of a hole being the access point to the Underdark and everything, and that most of the adventure was going to be inside kind of a tropical woody area. Now, if you guys remember the video, there was this great scene where they came across a Druid's Mound, and there's some theory that maybe the Druid Mounds are tied to the three moons, and that's why the harvest is so good, or at least that's why it was exceptionally good in the area that they were guarding. That was totally from the hip, but that's kind of a lie at the same time. There's always been this lore about Druid Mounds floating around in D&D and things like that, that plants grow better in the areas, they're protected. I always felt that player death should be important, so I really like stuff like Druid Mounds, Death Mage Sargassas, things like that, where whoever died there must have had some power. Like, if I have a player who dies and they happen to be a druid and they happen to be like level 6 or above, which was actually a fairly potent person in the world, they may end up like their death where they fell may end up creating some sort of ripple effect in the world. Speaking of ripple effect, if you haven't seen Out of Character's ripple effect video, go ahead and check it out, and you'll kind of see why I'm using that phrase, because I thought it was a good video. But basically, say the druid falls here. The druid, when he falls, let's say his body is kind of forgotten about and he just dies and passes into the ground. Then the elements around him, his body will return to the dirt, and because he was so powerful, the dirt will become more powerful and the soil will become more rich and allow for greater plants to be grown, things that are oversized, more in abundance than normal, things like that. And that was the whole idea of the Druid Mound. Now, if you want to do it with mages, I mentioned the Death Mage Sargassa. That's basically a powerful mage that dies, and his lust for power basically consumes him even in the afterlife. So within, usually it's like 100 yards or more of the mage's dead body, it's an anti-magic zone, and it's such a weird anti-magic zone that it's basically things that are consumable will be consumed inside that zone. Things that have charges, the charges will be used up. Magic weapons that do not have charges but are a permanent weapon will maintain as a regular weapon, but they will have no properties until you leave the the Death Mage Sargassa. If you happen to have like a Necromancer that falls instead of a Death Mage Sargassa, what you could do is have like an undead army rise up and kill whoever killed the Necromancer. And if they can't find that person, they just wander around the body of the Necromancer protecting it. Even maybe possibly burying it and putting it in some sort of bone shrine or something like that. You can have a lot of fun with these classes, playing with them and seeing what you could do to give them a lasting point if you happen to have players die. That's where the idea basically of the Druid Mound really originates, is having an impact on the world. The other interesting place was the Myconid throne room, which is where they fought the spore Hydra. Which was totally cool because I wanted the throne room to be this big area, and it was the only area that really supported the Myconid, or excuse me, the Spore Hydra. So it worked out really well. And I kind of, for the sake of a one shot, kept my pacing real strong inside there. I wrote up an XP budget per the bestiary just to kind of play with it, see what it's like. Because usually my home group, I usually ignore challenge ratings, and in fact when we played our 5th edition game, I picked out things that made sense in the story, but I didn't necessarily pay attention to challenge ratings or XP budgets, and I let them do what felt natural to them. So occasionally they would get themselves in situations where they would have to back off, or they couldn't possibly win, or they were in just really dire straits. And I like that for a home game. I wanted to try out this XP encounter budget. It worked okay, but I kind of abandoned it halfway through the game because it was actually kind of taxing to get to the point that I could do 4,800 experience in a day. So I had a couple of adventures pre-planned right here, and then I opened up my monster manual and had those monsters up. I use 2 screens, so one screen is usually where my monster manual hides. Now, one note, I usually dock on this desktop right here along the right side, and then I open Google Hangouts over in this section, which is perfect for me when running a game. And then I have the optional in here. Had we not had a player leave, I was actually going to have Frosthammer come out and fight the party. And it would be up to them to decide, should we make the cure, which would be a time event where they have to distract Frosthammer and not kill him for a couple rounds while the alchemist, or excuse me, the mage, was crafting the cure, or they could kill him. And if they saved him, I was actually going to give some bonus experience. I got this idea from Horde of the Dragon Queen, and one of the points of the adventure, right at the beginning, you get a chance to save villagers, and they give you a little bonus experience for saving villagers. And I thought that was a really great thing to do, because a lot of times Dungeons & Dragons is about killing the monsters, not saving the people. And so it was cool to see that officially Dungeons & Dragons said, maybe that's not the best way to do things. So I decided that I'd have that optional experience there for saving Lieutenant Frosthammer. Now, if they killed him, I was going to give them experience, just it'd be a lesser amount. The other thing that's cool about this chart is it let me calculate experience right at the end, real easy. So the Jackal initiation. I was watching the original the Copper Jackals campaign that Tim and James put on, or game I should say, that Welcome to the Dirt Box that Tim and James put on. And they go through the initiation ceremony, and I really liked it. And then me, Tim, and another person, Jonathan, from Out of Character, got in a conversation. We were talking about how the Copper Jackals are kind of like split into different factions or chapters, kind of like a motorcycle gang would be. That they all fall under the same kind of credos and rules, but they all handle themselves and govern themselves basically the same. And that, if you wear the Copper Jackal colors, you're a brother, and, you're going to adhere to the code. So I decided to put my chapter actually under the ocean. And they had the Jackal Djinn, and I thought it would be fun to play with that concept, so I made a Jackal Merid. And whereas the Jackal Djinn, you have this mysterious air to him, and he doesn't really reveal what he is, and you could feel that he's something more than what he appears to be. I decided to make the Jackal Merid a literal Merid who was amusing himself and thought that the Copper Jackals was a duty that took him away from his pleasure and enjoyment. So he's loud and boisterous, and he tells you to tell him a tale, and that what he's taking from new Copper Jackals is because Copper Jackals usually become fixated on their jobs. They lose focus on who they are, as far as like socially who they are. And so for him, it's trying to reconnect with who he is. So he asks them to tell him a tale, paint, entertain, do something. And then he tells them, even this you cannot take with you, to show that they must give up who they are with the story or artwork or whatever they've done. And he even tells them that you can't even take your name. Now, the one thing that I caught myself doing, and this was a total shoot from the hip, and I'm really glad I did it, was for the character with the sword, the Weaver, Ramus Silverhilt, he had a flute built into his sword, and he played the song, and he went to cast aside the sword. And I decided to take the sword and not let him throw it away, because ultimately we had this discussion that Ramus had PTSD, and it wasn't the song that he played was more about his condition than necessarily the art of music. So I thought it was very symbolic to catch the sword and have this conversation. And it was a great fit because Hunatha, who became known as the father, lost his son, and so the Myriad gave this point well, it was a very heartfelt thing, and revealed a little bit more to the Myriad's character because he wasn't loud and boisterous during this point, where he kind of tells them that that you must push on, that you must become more for them, and that with the Copper Jackals you can do that. Then you drink the Jackal Gin, which the Myriad and pretty much the rest of the party felt was pretty disgusting after the way I described it to them. You toast, and then you poured to the ocean. Now, the Jackal Gin, as in the person who named them in the dirt box, had them throw their Jackal Gin, a little bit of it into the fire, and their items into the fire. I instead, because it was a Myriad in water, had them tossed to the sea, toast to the ocean, things like that. And there was this great moment where they all held out their glasses over the edge of the water, and they held their toast, they took their drink, and then they poured to the ocean. And that's actually a callback to old sailor days where you would pour to the ocean or throw copper pieces in there for good luck before setting out to sea. Or even to please the sea gods and things like that. And during the game, I kind of thought about each of their characters, and so one of the things that I think some people are having trouble with is naming their Copper Jackals if they get into a naming session. This is what I would suggest for you. I suggest you read everyone's bio very carefully, and then see what they've done in other games. See what kind of character they're playing, because these names are going to stick with them, and it's kind of a buzzkill to be like, oh, I wrote this character, I spent 3 hours and thought about his name, because that's how I work personally. I'll make the character in 2 minutes and then spend 3 hours thinking about what should I name him. But I read over the stories, and I wanted to have names that symbolized who they were and who they are. So I had the chance to look at Danny Desert Face's previous game, and he's kind of a slob of a monk, and he's trying to teach his men a better way than strict piracy like he kind of grew up on, and he's definitely trying to become something more than what he has been. And that's part of his reason for going with the Jackals. And so to kind of remind him of his future with the Jackals, I named him the Abbot. Beetle had to leave early, unfortunately. If I get a chance to get him in a naming session, that'd be awesome. If I don't, I hope whoever gives Beetle a name actually puts a lot of time into it and gives him a good name. He's a pretty unique character and really cool. So that was great to see. Now Hunatha lost his child and carried the horn with him of his son, and I decided to name him the Father, which is kind of this like anti-Copper Jackal name, because a lot of them have these kind of like hard-edged names, or they've got this pointed name. His name is really soft, and Hunatha through the whole adventure did what he could to protect the group, and it may have been from guilt from losing his family, but he was kind of a fatherly figure, even if he didn't necessarily understand everything that was going on, because he was a gladiator for a long time. Excuse me. He was a gladiator for a long time, and he had questions, and he was seeking out camaraderie and things like that, and he was just trying to find his way in a world that has pretty much crapped on him. And so I thought the Father was a great thing for Hunatha, because he's got this protector type of personality to him. Manette has this great backstory where he goes through the museum and protects this stone slab that's got some ancient writing about the Copper Jackals, and so he also took time to care for his drawings and protected them. So originally I kind of played with some art terms, and originally I was going to give him a really strange French term, because I have background in art, And I thought it was fun, but I was like, no, this doesn't make sense. And as the game was progressing, he was very particular about his drawings and making sure that they were with him, and he would pull them out and display them and things like that. And I thought, he's doing this effort to preserve the works, and he's taking his time to preserve things and through art. So I was like, okay, how about we just change this to something easy? So he'll be the curator, like somebody who takes care of an art museum. Now, Ramus is the weaver. That was mainly because he's a story weaver. He's a storyteller, and the funny part is, for a bard, he's not very boisterous, and so the name was kind of meant to maybe encourage him to weave his story a little bit more to people and let them learn from his lessons and things like that. Which I'm looking forward to see how Ramus actually evolves with the Copper Jackals as any of these characters. It was totally fun. I mentioned probably 4 times now. Great group of guys. And if you do get a chance to play with any of them, definitely let them in your game and have some fun. This is just how I prepared the game, and I told you where I deviated from 5th edition. I think that there's some good points within the DMG, and I think that there's some stuff that you kind of learn as you play, and hopefully I'm able to convey those to you guys. So that's pretty much what I did for the Copper Jackal prep. It was super easy. The other thing I did for it was, you guys may have seen the Copper Jackal 3 Moons Harvest ad video that I did. That was just me coming on the channel, and I talked a little bit about what the adventure was going to be, and I've got my advertisement right here, which just kind of talks about things, and in the beginning, it kind of talks a little bit more focused on basic elements of the world and things like that, and then towards the end I go completely system factual and everything, and this was a great way for me to tell people, in the story and out of the story at the same time, what I was looking for. And I do recommend, when you do an advertisement for a game, that you get very specific about what your requirements are, because we don't typically have social contracts or at least official social contracts for one-shots, but I think that the GM has a lot of say in how his one-shot should operate, and a lot of times it's just players kind of coming in and out, and so the GM should have kind of default call on most things. So for here, I can't guarantee that it's going to be a success. The threats will be very real and lethal. This will be recorded, and I require you to have a working web camera and microphone, access to Google Hangouts, and a positive attitude. Should you succeed, you'll be minted and named. I wanted to let my players know that this was going to be an all-inclusive thing, so we want to get the Copper Jackals rolling, maybe do some high-level adventures too as well. So getting these players kind of work through the reins and everything like that, and getting them sanctioned as Jackals is probably one of the first steps in this whole process. So that's basically how I did it. Again, OneNote's been my best friend for most things, so if you like this one, check it out. It's Microsoft OneNote. I do not own it or anything like that. I just use the hell out of it because it's a great program. And as always, guys, feel free to like, comment, share, subscribe, and thanks for tuning into the channel. And hopefully I'll be seeing you guys at the gaming table.